like Celso has a question. Can you have BloodHound to look at the results of another BloodHound to plot the results? I'm not sure. I have not actually tried to do that. I think in theory it can. However, I would really not. I would say that would be a huge waste of processing power if you did that. Let's see. Let's try a little experiment. You know, BloodHound was not originally set up to do that, but maybe we can just try a quick little experiment here. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to take this BloodHound, this instance of BloodHound, and load the same ZZZ file into it, into the BloodHound that's going to be loaded into BloodHound. And I'm just a little concerned that I don't know what's going to happen with this big circular type of file open inside of a file. So I'm gonna use this new BloodHound on here to do some testing with. So actually, I'll just keep it simple and I'll just work on the solver tab. So now I'll drop the threshold solver down here. Give this a name. Alright, so I'm going to change that indicator over to BloodHound. And we have to load the file, right? Load a template file into BloodHound. So let's load this test one here. And I'm going to set it to this closing price inflection. Okay, and so here's the green and red plots that we see on the chart, right? So the long confidence plot here are the green signals, right? The long signals, and the short confidence plots are the short signals. So we'll use the long confidence for long evaluations, and we'll use the short plot here for the short evaluations. Let's see. Yeah, there's really no other settings here in BloodHound that we need to set. Just load up the template file. Alright, and the next step is I need to just need to put some threshold values in here. There we go. And then set up my short outputs. So keep in mind the threshold solver is the one solver that does not have any outputs predefined. So right. So this is how when you load up a new threshold solver, right, these are all set to 0. So even though you may have some thresholds set, you're not going to get any outputs from the threshold solver until you put some values in the long output or the short output. So we'll change that to 1 and set this to 1 for our shorts. And see what happens here. Alright, and we'll need to refresh the chart. So we're having to refresh the chart in order for BloodHound that's inside of BloodHound to load up that template file. And no, it does not seem to be working. me just double check, make sure I set things up correctly here. And I gotta say, I'm not too surprised that this doesn't work. Let's see, maybe if I wondering if maybe I open up a new file. Let's see, let's try something else here. So let me just get BloodHound off of here. Okay, now I'm going to add BloodHound back. And we'll do another little test here. So instead of loading up a file this time, I'll just build a simple solver right here on the solver tab. So we'll just look for the closing price to reverse. And we'll give that a try. You know, I gotta say, so this is definitely an overcomplicated way of trying to do something, and no, it doesn't look like it's going to work out. So I guess I'm not surprised. But gotta say, that was a fun test, though. So, all right, so there you go. Alright, so Julie's got another question here. Also, I have a Big Mike BloodHound page up if anyone wants to start posting on it. Great! Julie, hey, while I'm answering other people's questions, if you could provide the web page link, if you could just paste it in here, I will share it with everybody else. I'll be glad to share it with everybody else. That way people can have a direct link to it. Mike is asking, is BloodHound a resource hog? Well, no, not BloodHound directly. But what you got to keep in mind is that, BloodHound, you're loading all of these indicators into BloodHound. So you got to remember, every time you load an indicator into BloodHound, it's the same thing as just loading up your chart with all these indicators. So NinjaTrader has, they've really kind of refined CPU usage, and so when an indicator, right, I'll pick on the MACD here. So when you add a MACD indicator to the chart, NinjaTrader, what NinjaTrader does is it takes this indicator and it caches the data. Right, so NinjaTrader remembers the settings for this MACD, which is 12.26.9, right? And so NinjaTrader knows, okay, I've got a MACD indicator loaded up with these parameters set, and it builds a cache. And so if anything else is running on this chart that is also wanting to use the MACD with the same period settings, right, using the same 12.26.9 settings, the NinjaTrader will go, oh, I'm already calculating that indicator with those period values, so I'm not going to recalculate it again. I'm just going to grab the data from the cache. So every time you load up, if I loaded the same MACD indicator up into BloodHound, NinjaTrader is going to feed BloodHound that cached data. And so NinjaTrader kind of has its own built-in way of not having to calculate the same indicator twice. It knows that it's calculated at once, it caches all those values, and then it'll feed that out to any other indicator or strategy that may be using the same MACD with the same periods. So what you got to keep in mind is that, hey, when you're building a BloodHound system, it's pretty easy just to start building solvers and loading up all these solvers with all these different indicators, and so from that standpoint, it's pretty easy to forget that you're really loading up a bunch of indicators, because you only see BloodHound. You don't see all the indicators that are loading up inside of BloodHound. So visually, you may not realize that you're asking NinjaTrader to calculate a whole lot of indicators. And so that's why BloodHound can seem like it's a resource hog. But realistically, what BloodHound is doing is very simple calculations. So if I load up, so if we run through the list of solvers, for example, the bar direction, all it's doing is the bar direction, is just comparing the high to the low, I'm sorry, the close to the open. So the bar direction solver is just saying, is the close above the open? If it is, then provide a long signal. If the close is below the open, that's a very simple calculation. Takes no resources at all. A bar length, once again, a very simple math calculation. It just subtracts, the high of the bar to the low of the bar. Very simple calculation. So all these solvers are doing fairly simple things. Once again, a comparison solver is just doing a simple comparison. Let's see if I got one on here. Do I have a comparison solver on here? No. Let me drop this down. Let me add this on here. So this comparison solver, once again, you're taking, essentially you're taking, like the value from the white moving average and just comparing it to the red moving average, for an example, and you're just seeing, if one is above or below the other, and you can say by so many ticks. Once again, that's a very simple calculation, and all these solvers are doing relatively simple calculations. Even when you get into the support resistance solver, the support resistance solver is also doing some simple comparisons, right? So it's taken, typically with the support resistance solver, you're taking something like a moving average and you're comparing it to like a pivot line, a fixed value. So you're just checking to see if your moving average is essentially, in a very basic term, you're checking to see if your moving average is above or below a support resistance line. Well, actually, more directly, you're just seeing if your moving average is within so many ticks of a pivot line. I feel like I should just draw something. So we'll pretend that's our pivot line. So you're just doing a very simple mathematical formula. You're saying, is my moving average, so many ticks within the pivot line? Once again, very simple calculation for computers to do these days. So it's more the fact that you're loading up a lot of indicators, and then of course if you start building a lot of solvers, then of course, that's obviously going to require your CPU to calculate all those simple things. So, obviously, the bigger your BloodHound system gets, then the more resources it's going to require. I will say, so here's kind of some things that you can do to help minimize the CPU usage. So here's so some of the function nodes. Say for example, the signal blocker. So the signal blocker, right? What it's going to be doing is essentially this reset after. Here, let me just work on a new board here. Alright, so some of these function nodes that have a look back component to it, which would be the signal blocker, the signal extender, the signal counter, obviously the look back, right? And maybe a couple of other, yeah, maybe some of these others as well. Yeah, probably the toggle. No, I don't think the toggle node does. But essentially, right, like these three function nodes here, you'll notice that they have this reset after. Right, so what this reset after is doing is it is counting, it's kind of counting forward. If I set this to 50, it's counting forward 50 bars to know when it should reset itself. Same with the signal extender here. And so what's happening is, and let me put 50 in here as well. And so what's happening is, we think of it as this node kind of counting forward 50 bars. But really what the computers happen to do is it's always working, it's only working on the current bar. So what the computer is really doing behind the scenes is it's actually counting back 50 bars, and also with the signal blocker, it's counting back 50 bars. So that in itself can use a lot of resources. So every single one of these function nodes that has this, has this parameter here that's looking at 50 bars, it's having to count back and to check, for these conditions that you're looking for. So that in itself can be a really intensive CPU usage. So, so when you start adding a lot of these function nodes, you're asking the computer to constantly be counting back, however many bars you have set here. So, so my suggestion to minimize, the CPU usage is to, set these to as low of an amount as possible. But of course, you don't want to set it too low because then the condition that you're looking for, well, basically the signal blocker might reset itself too soon, But if you're in the habit of just throwing in 1,000 bars just to be absolutely positive that you're going to be blocking signals, in all cases, then I would suggest, maybe don't get in the habit of putting 1,000 bars in there. Maybe try something a little more reasonable, like 100 bars. Obviously it totally depends on your system. How many bars you really need to be blocking signals for. So that is something to be kind of mindful when you're using these function nodes. Logic nodes don't really have any resource issues, and yeah, all these logic calculations are very simple and quick. So yeah, these guys don't use up any resources. So Mike, it could be the function nodes that you're using, that you're encountering. So, all right, let's delete that. All right, so let me move on to another question here. Oh, Julie did post it. I just didn't get down. Julie did post the link. I just didn't get down to it. There it is. Let me also just put it on the screen here. So everybody should have that link in the chat box. Alright, I'll keep that down there for a little bit. Alright, thank you, Julie, for that. And Julie's asking, do we have a Fibonacci solver yet? Fibonacci solver, no, I don't think it'll be a solver. Because if you're looking to check for Fibonacci's, the comparison solver will do that, or the support resistance solver will do that. The missing component is getting the Fibonacci levels values out to out as a plot so that BloodHound can read it. And no, we haven't gotten that yet. I believe what I've been hoping to do is let me get rid of some of these indicators here on this chart. So I believe that one of these indicators that we're using, written by Dorshand, it's either the swings or actually I believe it's the inside the swings or the swings high lows. I believe there's code inside there that's calculating the Fibonacci numbers, but we just need to make the time to get into that code and expose it, make it available so that BloodHound can read it. So that's really what we need to do. But I'm sorry, I'm sad to say that there's just been so many other higher priorities, so we haven't gotten around to looking into that. Let's see. All right, so here's a good question that comes around a lot, and and it's regarding bar types. Right, so NinjaTrader actually it's not the bar type. Oh wait, yeah, it is. So Celso is asking, have you seen or do you have any experience with BloodHound working with point and figure type charts? So in theory, all a bar is just price data. How it looks, how it calculates, that's really mute. That's really insignificant. All that indicators really care about is what is the price of the closing, and what may be the price of the high or the low, depending on your indicator. How it visually looks on a chart, that's just a visual. But your indicators on the chart, essentially almost all indicators are just looking at the closing price. And so regardless of how your bar looks on your chart, there's always a closing price associated with that bar, and that's what indicators are looking at. So all indicators in theory should work with all bar types. And so Celso was wondering about the point and figure, and so I guess I'll just let's see, wave mode. So we'll just load that up, and so once again, even right, so my moving average is on here and the SI swings, right? So regardless of how your bar looks, NinjaTrader is still calculating a closing price for each bar and feeding that closing price data to the indicators. And so NinjaTrader will feed that closing price data also to BloodHound, because BloodHound is simply just an indicator. So BloodHound should work with all price bars, just like a moving average will work with all the different chart types, I should say, or a price bar. So Celso, there shouldn't be any issues there. Yeah, even these point and figures, they do have an open and close. Let me expand this out. Right, so every bar, it has an open up here at the top and it has a close at the bottom, but also that bar has a high at the top and a close at the bottom. So it has the 4 price point data. And you know what? Here's a neat way of looking at that. Let's load up SI Chameleon. Alright, so I'm going to turn on some of these price points here. And let's even take a look at the median here. Take a look at this median. And alright. Make it cyan, something nice and bright, and I'll change it we'll make it the cross, yeah. So we can see here that chameleon is finding, right, the green hash line represents the high, the red one represents the low, and you can see a little white dot. Hopefully you can see a little white dot. Maybe I should make that a little bigger. That's representing the closing price. I guess I should have left that on 3. Right, so that white dot represents the closing price, and there's our little cross, cyan cross there in the middle, represents the midpoint. Right, so I hope that kind of gives you a visual concept that all price bars have all this price data in it, so it doesn't matter what bar you use. Right, and so there we go. If I just put on my logic here that's just looking for price to reverse, and there you go, all that BloodHound's finding every time the bar reverses on us. And so, you know, in theory, this should be true of all third-party vendor indicators out there, that the price bar shouldn't matter. However, you know, some people's systems may not work with a point-and-figure type chart. You know, some people's, you know, a lot of vendors are selling you, you know, trading signals, special indicators or trading signals, and you know, those I guess the calculation, you know, the math behind their indicator and the conditions, the calculations behind their indicator, you know, may only work reliably with certain bar types, you know, such as a range bar, you know, whereas, you know, their system may not work on a minute bar, you know. So that's where maybe that misconception is coming along, that some people believe that certain bar types don't work with certain indicators. So, all right, I think I kind of, hopefully I beat that one to death. All right, so good question. I've got one more left here from Julie. All right, so Zach, can you please show us again how to put the dots on the moving average lines? All right, so let's start with that one. So let me prepare my chart here. Okay, I'm going to work with the stochastic here. Yeah, so this is a question that came up, and so as Julie had mentioned, you know, I probably showed this about a year ago or so, yeah, but it just came up recently. Right, so Julie's wanted to know, how do you put the dots on top of another indicator, right? So the issue is, when you look at the stochastics, you really don't know exactly on this line what the value is. You know, you can't see it visually because you can't see, because NinjaTrader, right, is connecting the dots. So on the stochastic is really a bunch of values, you know, that you could represent as dots, but instead, since we have it on the line plot, right, all the dots are being connected, and so you can't see where those dots are anymore, you know, unless you get something like, unless you get a point like right here. You know, this is obvious that that's where that price point is right where the line made a sharp turn, right? So that one's obvious, but you know, if you're looking along here, you know, you really don't know, you know, where could that dot be? Is it there? Is it there? You know, it's hard to see visually. So one way that you can help visualize where that stochastic value is what you do is you just put a second stochastics on top of it. So let me add another stochastics. Let's see, I'm just using, yeah, 714.3, 714.3. Great. And So the first thing you have to do is make sure that you change the panel here. So we want to put it on panel 2. Remember, the price panel is always panel 1, and then the next panel down will be panel 2. And since I'm using a black chart, I'll put a white on there, and I'm going to put dots. Let me change this to dots. And 2, I think 2 will work good. Let's try this out. Yeah, 2 works. So now you can actually see the actual value of the stochastic by looking at the dot underneath. And so here's kind of where this comes handy when you're working with a BloodHound system. So I was so a customer wanted to know if let's see what. Trying to remember. So they were using the inflection solver. So let me build this slowly, one solver at a time. So they were looking for when something like the stochastic was reversing direction. So let's put the stochastics in here so we can find when the stochastic's reversing direction. And alright, we want to use the D plot. Okay, so simple enough, right? We can see now whenever the stochastic turns down, right, we're getting a short output, and a long output when the stochastic turns upwards. And let's see, what else were they doing? They were checking for when the stochastic, crosses this, 80 or 20 level. So we can I think it was the crossover solver. Or I'm trying to remember if it was the crossover solver or the threshold solver that was being used. Yeah, I'm going to go with the crossover solver for now. And so, oops, switch this over to the stochastic. And we're looking for the stochastic to cross the 80 or 20. So I'm going to use an absolute value, and we'll find when it crosses the 80 line. Right, there we go. And oops, before I get too far ahead of myself, I should name these. And oh, you know what? Okay, now I remember exactly how it was. It was using the threshold. So let me drop the threshold on here. And I don't really need that crossover. Let me get rid of it. Yeah. Alright, so the stochastics, and we're looking for 80-20. So I'm going to load up the stochastics real quick. Alright, so we're looking for the when the stochastic gets up into the 80 area or down into the 20 area. And hopefully you guys have noticed by now I made a critical mistake so far in that we can't have a 0 in between 80 and 20. Remember, all these values need to go down in descending order, right? So 0 is less than 20, so we can't have this 0 here. So I need to change that to something in the middle, so I'm going to change it to 50, just to put some kind of value in the middle. Alright, so we're interested when we're up in the 80 range for longs. So there we go. That's working out good. And we're interested also, actually, you know what? Let me reverse this logic here. I'm going to reverse the outputs here. Yeah. So this is typically how it's used, right? So when we're in this oversold area, typically you're looking for a long signal. All right, we're in the overbought, you're looking for a short. And also what's needed is, so what was being looked for is, we want to make sure that we're in this overbought or oversold territory, and then looking for that, the moment the stochastic reverses. And I think, oh good, I think this will work out perfect. Right here, we're going to take a look at this area right here. Alright, so let's take a look at the inflection. Alright, so we had the inflection actually occur right on this bar. So let me mark it. So this is when the inflection occurred, right here. Now let's take a look at the threshold solver again. And we'll note that these two green dots represent when we're below the 20 area. So now what we're looking for is we want to know when both occur at the same time. Well, basically, yeah, we want to know when both occur at the same time. So we want to, right, so normally if we look at this, right, now look, it's working out great. We're getting this short here, this long here, right, and we're only getting, the shorts or longs when we're in this overbought or oversold area. Works great, and you go, and then you look at this point right here and you go, well, wait a minute, the stochastic was in the 20 area, but I'm not getting a signal. And the reason why, I'm going to stretch this out to exaggerate the point. Right, so now with the dots on the stochastics, we can see that the value of the stochastic, let me back up here first, let me give you a visual. So let me plug the inflection in, right? So right here, this bar is when the inflection occurred. But we can now see, looking at the dot, that the stochastic was no longer below 20 anymore. And so that's why we didn't get a signal. But if you didn't have the dots there, you would just think, well, hey, something's broken. How come that's not working? And so that's what the question kind of was, why aren't some of these working out? And the way you fix this is you need to move here. Let me so we're looking at the threshold condition right now. So what you need to do is move this condition forward one bar, and that will solve it. So if I put a displacement of 1 in there, right, you see how that moves forward one bar? And now if we look at the whole condition, now you can see, now we're getting that long signal when the stochastic dipped into 20 and then turned up. And now if we look at all the, if I shrink this up, there you go. Now you can see all the signals here are working. So having kind of my point of building this whole system for you was to kind of illustrate how sometimes putting these dots on there can really help. You know, or you could just, you know, simply take the one indicator, and I could have just, you know, changed this to a dot. Obviously, I didn't have to put both on there. And oops, no, there we go. You know, so I could have been just working with the stochastic like this, and you know that probably would have pointed it out, but that's just kind of a preference thing. So there you go, kind of 2-for-1 deal on that question. And yeah, Randy's got a good point. Let me, that's right. Randy's pointing out changing the Z order. So let me put the green line back on, and hopefully I can get that white dot. So I think if I hold down the shift key and hold the shift key down and I'm scrolling my mouse wheel, you can see how it's changing the Z order. So NinjaTrader's there we go. So now the white dots are on top of the green line. Yeah, so the way I did that is you hold the shift key down and then scroll your mouse wheel up and down. So if you don't have a mouse wheel, I'm sure there's some other way of doing it. You'll have to look in NinjaTrader's help guide to find that out. There's probably a keyboard combination, like maybe shift plus, shift minus, or something like that. I don't know, or the up or down arrows. All right. Okay, now the second part of Julie's questions. Oh, so Julie was just asking, are you just clicking the plot lines, or is there a way to get the dots up so you can compare ticks? Yeah, Julie, that's what I was doing earlier, is I was just clicking on the indicator to bring up those dots. And those dots don't really, I don't think they, well, maybe they do. I guess those dots are representing the actual price points, you know, every so many bars. It looks like NinjaTrader's spacing them 4 bars apart, but I bet you if I scale this, yeah, I never really looked into this, but it looks like NinjaTrader just automatically spaces those dots 4 bars apart. Yeah, so I was just clicking on the indicator beforehand. Okay. All right, looks like we got one last question here from Celso. All right, when using an indicator, i.e. the stochastics you are using right now, all right, do you have a way to find when the angle stops rising and begins to fall? Yes, so that is the inflection solver. So that's what an inflection is. So the inflection solver there. So this inflection solver, inflection is generally used in mathematical terms as a change in direction. And so I know, you know, the common word should have been like the reversal solver. You know, so that's what the inflection is doing, is it's looking for this change in angle for when an indicator, right, is changing from sloping down to up or up to down. Let's see. So Celso is saying no, not the point of direction. All right, let me read your question again there, Celso. So Celso, maybe what you're asking is there a way to find the angle when an indicator stops rising or continuing to rise, but the slope begins to kind of fall off a little bit when the slope isn't rising so quickly? So let me find someplace on the stochastic here. Alright, how about, let me stretch this way out. So Celso, is this kind of like what you're looking for? Is like this area right in here? So we have a steep rising angle on the stochastic, and then we can see the stochastic begins, the slope is still rising, but it's beginning to peter off. Is that kind of what you're asking there, Celso? So I'm just going to wait for, alright, so he's saying look at 9:30 to 10:30. Alright, 9:30 to 10:30. Alright, so I take it you're looking, well, basically I think you're looking at this point here that's being marked by BloodHound, right? This point right here, this point right here is what you're wanting to identify. There is at 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock. Alright. This point right here, yeah, alright, so Celso, you're looking at when, yeah, so the stochastic is rising and rising and rising and rising at a steeper and steeper slope. It's still rising, but the slope is beginning to fall off. Okay, yeah, well that's the same thing as over here. This is all still rising, right? Even these two bars here are rising, but just not as at as steep of an angle. So this is the same thing. It'll find the same thing. So yes, the answer to that is we do. That is what the change in slope solver does. So let's connect that up, and we'll throw the stochastics in here so we can take a look at it. Alright, yep, so the stochastic periods are all correct. We want the D plot. And let's take a look at the chart. And let's just look at the long side for now. We'll clear this up. There we go. That's a little visually a little easier to see, to comprehend. So let's get rid of that. Get rid of these circles here. Alright, so we'll go back to this 10 o'clock point here. So you can see, so look right here. Right here is when the first bar that we begin to get an output, right? And as the stochastic, right, the stochastic is sloping down, but we can see maybe if let me stretch this out a little bit, help exaggerate the angle here. So we can see here, well, yeah, it's still kind of hard to see, but you know, as the stochastic moves on, we can see that the angle, the falling angle, is lessening. You know, it's less of a down angle because it's, you know, the stochastic is beginning to turn up, and we can see that, right. So as it's beginning to turn up, the output of the default settings here, these default outputs, you know, you can see that the long side is beginning to increase until finally, right here, the slope is actually sloping up. And we can see, let me pull this down a little bit, and we can see that the steepness of the stochastic is continuing to increase and increase and increase and increase. And then finally, on this bar here is when the angle here is actually not, so the angle is not rising anymore. The angle is beginning to kind of fall off as the stochastic is beginning to kind of round up and turn down. So we can see that as the upslope of the angle is not rising as steeply, so the angle is beginning to fall off a little bit, and we can see that the output from the solver is beginning to taper off as well. And so let me back up here. Yep. So here's a good point. And I'm going to put the green line on top. I think hopefully that makes it a little easier to see the angle. And so we can see here, you know, we get a lot of choppiness, right? So the solver is identifying when the stochastic slopes up a little bit more, and then the up angle falls off for one bar, and then it rises again quickly, and then it doesn't, the slope isn't quite as steep once again, and then the slope of the stochastic begins to steepen more and more and more, and then we can see it's still rising, but it's beginning to taper off. So the angle isn't continuing to steepen, but it's beginning to fall off. And that is all controlled here by these outputs. Let me stretch this open so we can read them. Okay, so we can see the first one here, right, is strong in direction. So if I use this area for an example, right, so when the angle begins to steepen, that is the strong in direction, when the angle begins to steepen. So as long as the angle continues to steepen, or at least stay at the same slope, we get this strong in direction. And so now I'm going to switch back over to this area for explaining. So number 2 is in the direction, but turning. You know, not literally turning, but we can see that the angle right here, right, the angle right here on this, right here, we can see it's not quite as steep as it was previously. So it's kind of beginning to turn. And we can see the output here drops. So let me slide this all the way over. So if we look at BloodHound's output right here, we can see it equals 0.66 on this bar right here, and we can see it matches the output here. So if I wanted to, I could change that to 0.5, and we can see now the value coming out of that solver is adjusted down to 0.5. So now if we move on to number 3, you're right, it's in the direction but greatly turning. What that really is saying is that what happened was we got a second bar where the angle is still tapering off. So we're still sloping up in the same direction, but we're turning even more. And so we can see that the solver's output is now at 0.33, which matches right here. All right, and I could adjust that down to 0.25 if I wanted to. And then we can see over here the solver's output is at 0.25. And then there's even, you can even control the output for the opposite direction. So let's find a place to work for that. Yeah. So let's take a look at this area right here. So we can see that right, the stochastic is in a downslope, but we're still getting a long signal out of the solver. And so this first bar is coming from number 5. So you can see number 5 says opposite direction, right? Now, well, yeah, that's because the stochastic is sloping down. So it's the opposite direction of the long signal we're getting out. So the first bar that this downslope begins to weaken, so when the slope begins to weaken here, that is when output here, item number 5, is evaluated. Let me slide the chart over. Yep, so there. So I could change this to 0.1. Right now we can see the output is 0.1. So it's beginning to, so you can use the solver to begin to tell your system that, hey, the downslope is beginning to weaken. So, maybe start looking for a possible long. Now if we get, for item number 4, move to the next bar over. So now we have a second bar where once again the downslope is weakening again for the second time. And so then we're getting this value outputted. And so we can see that's at 0.66. And once again, we even got a third bar that's weakening. So that is actually technically sloping down still. It looks flat, but it's still technically sloping down. And so therefore, we're still in this opposite direction but greatly turning area until finally the stochastic actually starts sloping up. And then we switch over to the strong in direction. And so now if I turn on both the longs and the shorts, so now we can see it's beginning to make a little more sense now. So up in here where the stochastic is sloping down pretty strongly, as we can see by the short output, and then as the downslope begins to weaken or begins to turn, we can see the long output begins to lessen or weaken, and the long output begins to strengthen, or the long output begins to get greater. So I'm going to reset those. There. So there's the default setting. Oh, And you know, there is this option number 6, strong in opposite direction. So if I set this to, I'll just set it to 0.1, and so you can see we're now getting this 0.1 on the long side here when the stochastic is strongly moving down. We're getting this, you know, small value, whatever value I put in here is what we'll get on the long side, because the long side is, you know, remember this says opposite direction. So the long output is opposite of a downslope. And then of course, when the stochastic is sloping up over here, now we're getting this -1 on the short side based on this. So I'm going to put that back to 0. Alright, I hope that gives another good thorough explanation. So there is a, you know, once again, if you go to the documentation, you know, you can watch a video on this again. So I'm on the BloodHound documentation page. I'm going to scroll down, and under references, if I go to the change in slope indicator here, click on it, and then you'll see there's a video tutorial up here under contents. And so here's kind of a previous workshop video that will start talking about this solver here. Alright. Okay guys, I guess with that I will wrap this up. So hey, have a good weekend, and we'll talk to you later. And remember, if you'd like to see anything demonstrated in these workshops, you know, please send your questions in ahead of time, and that would be greatly appreciated. Alright guys, have a good weekend. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.